There is a man in the Bible who appears out of nowhere, with no father, no mother, and no genealogy, blesses the most important man in the entire Old Testament, and then disappears forever. His name was Melchizedek, and what the Bible doesn't say about him has generated more theological debate than almost any other figure in Scripture. Genesis 14 tells the story of a war between several regional kings, a conflict that ends with Abraham's nephew, Lot, captured along with his family. Abraham gathers his men, pursues the captors, and manages to rescue Lot and recover everything that had been taken. On the way back, with no prior introduction, no genealogy, no context, a king named Melchizedek, king of Salem, appears. The text adds a short but powerful phrase: he was priest of God Most High. Melchizedek comes out to meet Abraham with bread and wine and pronounces a blessing over him in the name of that God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. Abraham, the man who throughout the rest of Genesis receives promises directly from God, responds to this encounter by giving him a tenth of everything he had recovered. And after that scene, as brief as it is intense, Melchizedek disappears from the Genesis narrative entirely. He never appears again, not even once. No other character in Genesis gets such an abrupt entrance and such a definitive exit in just 3 verses. The name Melchizedek, in Hebrew, translates as King of Righteousness, and Salem, the place he rules, means peace. In other words, in a single name and a single title, the text describes a king of righteousness who rules over peace, a combination no other ruler in the Bible receives. Most scholars identify Salem with the city that would later be known as Jerusalem, though Genesis itself doesn't explicitly confirm that at this point. What is clear is that Genesis, a book obsessed with genealogies, one that devotes entire chapters to listing who fathered whom, keeps total silence about this man's origin. We don't know who his father was. We don't know who his mother was. We don't know what tribe or people he came from. We don't know when he was born or when he died. In a book where every relevant character gets a genealogy, Melchizedek is the most striking exception of all. For centuries, this silence went relatively unnoticed, until another Old Testament book mentions his name again in a way that completely changes his significance. Psalm 110, one of the most quoted psalms in the entire New Testament, contains a declaration addressed to a future king. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. That phrase connects a king who would come centuries later with a priest-king figure who occupies barely 3 verses in the entire Old Testament. No other biblical character receives the honor of having his order or type of priesthood become the prophetic category of a coming king. And that's where the mystery deepens even further, because the New Testament picks up this figure and gives him an attention that seems disproportionate compared to the 3 original verses in Genesis. The letter to the Hebrews devotes an entire chapter to explaining why this figure is so relevant to understanding the priesthood of Jesus. And there appears the phrase that has generated more debate than any other about this character. He is described as without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. That description never appears in Genesis. Genesis simply omits that information. It is Hebrews that turns that absence of information into an almost supernatural characteristic. The question that has divided commentators for nearly 2,000 years is exactly this. Is Hebrews using a rhetorical device about the text's silence, or is it suggesting that Melchizedek was literally a being who was not born and did not die like any other man? The most widespread interpretation among traditional Jewish and Christian commentators is that it's an argument based on the text's silence. Since Genesis doesn't mention his genealogy, he is presented as if he had no beginning or end, unlike the Levitical priests whose genealogy was an absolute legal requirement. But that same ambiguity is precisely what has generated, for generations, much bolder interpretations of his true nature. Later, rabbinic tradition tried to solve the mystery by identifying Melchizedek with an already known character, Shem, the son of Noah. According to that reading, if you carefully calculate the genealogies in Genesis, Shem would still be alive in Abraham's time, and some ancient rabbis suggested that Shem, as priest and surviving patriarch of the flood, might have ruled the region under this other name. This theory solves the problem of the missing genealogy, since Shem does have a known genealogy in Genesis, but it doesn't explain why the text deliberately avoids making that connection explicit, if that was the original intent. Another fascinating clue appears centuries after the Old Testament was written, in a place far removed from any synagogue or temple, the caves of Qumran near the Dead Sea. Among the manuscripts discovered in those caves in the mid-20th century is a fragmentary text known as the Melchizedek document, catalogued as 11Q13. In that text, written by a Jewish community that lived in isolation several centuries before Jesus, Melchizedek is not simply an ancient king from Abraham's past. He is described as a heavenly figure who will return at the end of days to execute divine judgment, free the captives, and proclaim a final year of grace. In other words, for this Jewish desert community, centuries before Christianity, Melchizedek had already stopped being just a character from Genesis's past and had become an almost angelic end-times figure. This document proves that fascination with Melchizedek's true identity didn't begin with Christianity, but was already present within Second Temple Judaism, generations before the letter to the Hebrews was written. Over the centuries, this fascination reached an extreme that the early church itself had to confront directly. A group known as the Melchizedekians came to hold that Melchizedek was not a man at all, but a divine being, superior even to Jesus, a kind of heavenly power that briefly manifested in Abraham's days. This idea was firmly rejected by the early church fathers, precisely because it diluted Christ's unique centrality. But the fact that an entire group reached that conclusion shows how deep the confusion this character generated really was. Let's go back now to the detail that for many readers is the most intriguing of the whole scene in Genesis 14, the offering of bread and wine. No other encounter between Abraham and a foreign king in all of Genesis includes this specific gesture. Other regional kings offer him deals, riches, or alliances, never bread and wine shared as part of a priestly blessing. Christian tradition, much later, would not overlook that detail. Early church fathers like Ambrose and Jerome saw in that offering a direct foreshadowing of the Eucharist, centuries before Christianity existed. And this connects to another point that the letter to the Hebrews develops very carefully: the difference between Melchizedek's priesthood and the Levitical priesthood that would come centuries later with the law of Moses. The Levitical priesthood depended absolutely on genealogy. Only someone who could prove descent from the tribe of Levi, and within it the line of Aaron, could be a priest. Melchizedek, on the other hand, is a priest without needing to prove any genealogy, which makes his priesthood, according to Hebrews' argument, something earlier and superior to the one the law would later establish. The argument becomes even bolder. Hebrews holds that when Abraham gave a tenth to Melchizedek, in a certain symbolic sense Levi did too, because Levi hadn't been born yet but was, we could say, in the body of his great-grandfather Abraham. It's a complex theological argument, designed to show that the priesthood foreshadowed by Melchizedek doesn't depend on human lineage, but on a different, older calling than the law itself. Going back to Genesis, there's another detail worth noting. The scene happens right after a bloody battle, at a moment of maximum political tension between the region's kingdoms. And yet, in the middle of that context of war and plunder, the only gesture the text chooses to record in detail is not a military negotiation, but a priestly blessing accompanied by bread and wine. This has led some commentators to wonder whether Melchizedek's narrative function in Genesis is not so much historical as symbolic, representing in a single encounter the idea that a legitimate priestly authority existed outside the people of Israel, even before Israel existed as a nation. This idea matters because it places the recognition of Abraham's God outside the ethnic boundaries that would later define the Hebrew people, something very few other passages in Genesis suggest so clearly. There's also a detail almost always overlooked. Melchizedek blesses Abraham, not the other way around. In almost every other encounter in the Old Testament, it is Abraham who receives blessings directly from God. Here, instead, Abraham submits to another man's blessing and priestly authority, a man about whom we know absolutely nothing else. That simple gesture, giving the tenth and accepting the blessing, has been interpreted by generations of commentators as proof that Melchizedek occupied, within the story's structure, a position of spiritual authority even higher than that of the patriarch of Israel himself. If Melchizedek was simply a local Canaanite king, why does the man chosen by God to found an entire nation bow to his priestly authority without any recorded objection in the text? And if he wasn't simply a local Canaanite king, who exactly was he? The Bible, whether deliberately or not, never answers that question clearly. He appears, blesses, receives the tenth, and disappears, leaving behind almost 2,000 years of uninterrupted theological speculation. Neither Rabbinic Judaism, nor the Qumran documents, nor the early church fathers, nor medieval theologians ever fully agreed on his true identity. Some consider him a simple, pious Canaanite king, a Gentile who recognized the same God as Abraham before the law of Moses existed. Others consider him a prophetic figure, a literary symbol anticipating the royal priesthood that would come with the Messiah centuries later. And others, following the boldest reading of Hebrews, consider him a temporary manifestation of a heavenly being, possibly the Son of God himself, appearing before his human incarnation, a theory known as a Christophany. None of these interpretations fully resolves the original problem. Why Genesis, a book that never leaves a relevant character without a genealogy, decides to leave this one in complete silence? Perhaps that silence is precisely the key. In an era when identity, social status, and religious authority depended almost entirely on genealogy and family lineage, the appearance of a priest with none of those credentials was, in itself, an anomaly impossible to ignore. Perhaps the author of Genesis himself wanted to make clear, through that deliberate silence, that Melchizedek's authority didn't depend on where he came from, but on whom he served. And maybe that's why, almost 4,000 years after that brief encounter on the road back from a war, we're still asking ourselves the same question the first readers of this text asked. Who was the man who blessed Abraham really? The Bible doesn't answer with a clear formula. It shows it just once, in 3 verses that have generated nearly 2,000 years of uninterrupted debate. If this kind of biblical silence that has gone unresolved for generations grips you as much as it grips us, this is exactly the kind of mystery we explore every week on this channel. Stories the Bible barely mentions in passing, but that hide questions even the greatest scholars have never fully closed. Subscribe if you want to keep uncovering these narrative gaps, and tell us in the comments, who do you think Melchizedek really was? See you in the next mystery.